So it's kind of clear to see by the decal there. This is a Yaesu FRG-7700. This is a communications receiver, so no microphone jack. Only does one thing, receive. Customer got this, and apparently it came from, I guess, actually, what the heck does his note say? He's been sitting in a closet shelf for 4 to 5 years. Husband, a ham, died. Wife is now selling to move, yada, yada, yada. He couldn't get anything out of it. Originally, it didn't do anything at all. He played with the buttons for a while, and he did finally get the frequency display to start showing, but still no sound. So he sent it to me. Pretty much knows it's going to need an electrolytic capacitor change, as old as it is. And it's been sitting unused for a while. But as you can hear, it's alive and working. And there's what brought it back to life? That can right there. A can of deoxit and a towel. Actually, about a half a can of deoxit. Woo! Boy, has this thing been sitting. Wasn't kidding. The controls, man, the volume was full volume. You could, well, the internal speaker's dead, but yeah, it may not be dead, but it's no sound coming out of it. That's what you were hearing was actually coming from an external speaker plugged into a jack on the back. But yeah, at first I only had volume with the control up the entire way, and it blow you out of your seat. Yeah, good spray out with some deoxit on the controls. That seemed to straighten them up. I had static, but I still could barely receive anything. Hook up communications test set to the antenna jack. Didn't matter what band I was on, I'd shove a huge signal into it. I could hear it, but it was, reception was just horrible. So one of the first things is an old radio. You're having crusty connection problems and whatnot. Bad connector, stuff can get crunchy over the years. Because the screws on the case of this thing, they show a little bit of rust and oxidation. So yeah, moisture might have been a problem. So, it never hurts just to pull and reseat the connectors. And as soon as I got back here, I touched this wire and I heard something. And then I let go and it went away. Well, this has a switch. Matter of fact, if I turn the volume up, see if we can find... So, you can see we got a signal. Can't really hear anything now. And there it's back. It has a local DX switch on the back. Yeah, again, crusty switch. The contacts in that were just oxidized. So, again, another shot of deoxit and flipped that back and forth several times, and that got rid of it. So, basically, it was more or less stuck in the attenuated mode, in the local mode. So, it does seem to be working. Receive's still not stellar at the moment, like I say, but it is working. It's receiving. All modes seem to work. FM, wide, medium, and narrow band. So, there's narrow band. Now, of course, we're listening to a CW transmission right here. No, actually, close as we are, we'll just go to, we can pick up CHU Canada. There we go. So there's AM narrow, medium, and wide. Let's see, it's obviously a lot more pleasant to listen to narrow-banded.
Coordinated universal time, 23 hours, 15 minutes. That's positive. 58 minutes.
So, yep, it's working. Definitely needs a cleanup. Yeah, this thing, the controls, you can see how white that looks down in the edge. I don't know if this thing was sitting on a shelf in a closet or in the garage. Because, yeah, it's, like I say, it's been damp. And now it's not like it's horrible on the inside. The sheet metal on the inside's, other than dust on it, it's not really dirty. Excessively dirty, just the normal dust bunnies. It's got get the power and everything, speaker all unhooked there. It's got the normal dusties in there for as old as the radio is, and a few cobwebs on the underside, but yeah, it's not really, the chassis is rusty inside, so I wouldn't say it was really damp, but like I say, the screw heads were all rusty, so yeah, connectors, that's one of the first things to troubleshoot. Just make sure everything's got a good connect. Yeah, matter of fact, speaking of which, there's some cobwebs right there. So yeah, it needs a good clean out. Now actually recapping one of these, yes, it does have a lot of circuit boards, but it's not horrible. And the main reason is it's made by Yaesu, so it's very modular. Just plugs everywhere. Unplug all the plugs, take out the screws, the boards pretty much come out, then you can work on them out of the unit. So yeah, that's a big advantage here. You know, and honestly, there's not that many caps considering. I mean, you look at this board. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, there's what, 5 or 6 caps on this entire board. Shoot, there's just about as many on the power supply board. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Woo! Holy shit! Yeah, this thing needs recapped. Oh my god, that can cap. That thing's about ready to rupture, I think. I mean, I know the bridge rectifier is beside it. Hell, the bridge rectifier is colder than the electrolytic capacitor is. Wow, that thing is hot. Yeah, so that cap's bad. Another thing to watch out for on these things, you definitely want to get this stuff out of here. And this one, it's gotten to that point. Sony Bond, or whatever trade name you want to call it by. So you can see around the electrolytic capacitors, it's got that goop. Well, things to be aware of in a radio like this is that goop also, as you can see when they pour it around these caps, it's actually touching like the leads here. Eventually, and you can see it's just starting to turn brown. It's going from the light kind of cream tan color, and it's starting to discolor. I mean, you can see that over here around the edges. It's starting to get dark brown, and that's the point when it starts to become corrosive and conductive. So yeah, this one was just caught in time before it ate all the leads off right here, and it'll do the same thing to the caps. It's underneath the cap. It'll eat the leads off of the cap. So that stuff's definitely got to get removed. But yeah, I think overall it should clean up really nice. I mean, other than it's nasty with just dirt, I mean, you can see all the just almost mildew on it. And extremely dirty knobs and whatnot. I think take those off, drop them in ultrasonic cleaner, clean the bezel up a little bit. The covers aren't actually too bad. I think it'll clean up fairly nice. Recap and alignment, that's about all it's going to need. The memory unit, this does have the optional memory unit back here. Now the battery pack is unhooked. The customer did note that. Has a little access door in the bottom cover with the little battery holder in there, and the wires are there should be a battery snap on this. Actually, let me just grab the cover and show you. So there's the battery holder, and flipped around here without hitting the camera. Yeah, see, it actually has a 9-volt battery snap on there. But yeah, so the plug is gone, or the connector is gone on there. So I'll get a new one stuck on. But yeah, so I don't think it should be too bad. Pop the boards out, recap, clean, remove the glue, alignment, and this should be a good radio. I may go over and spray the controls all again, because like I say, they were really nasty. But so let me get to unplugging and unscrewing, get this critter done, and we'll see how much better the receive is. Because like I say, it's okay now, but and these aren't bad to align. Because this is not an amateur radio, it's made by an amateur radio company, but it's not a transceiver, I should say. That's probably the best way to put this. There's not a gazillion alignment points in here. Don't get me wrong. It's got, there's IF cans and transformers around here, and the bandpass filters, the ceramic trimmer caps for frequency adjustments and whatnot. But unlike a lot of ham radios, yeah, it's not horrible. It's not just stacks and stacks of boards with alignment points all over the place that can take hours to do. I mean, you do some of these ham rigs, man, they can take a really, really long time to do alignments on them. Doesn't look like anything's ever been adjusted in there, at least since it left the factory. You can see all the wax is still in here. All the cores are still sealed in the can. Yeah, I'd say it's probably never had the covers off of it, other than maybe somebody just to look at it. That one's still sealed. Everything's still sealed and waxed down in there. So let me get to working, and I shall return, hopefully with a much better performing radio. Well, just getting ready to call the customer, and I thought, well, I'll just give her a little bit better, closer inspection. And yeah, I'm going to say this thing has been damp. It's got some corrosion issues on the connectors. Now, the radio works. You heard that. It does receive. Honestly, the audio is a little, kind of what I usually describe as crunchy. Remember I said, you know, actually over here, like this can, the main cap on the power supply board, that sucker is getting hot. You know, cap's going bad a lot of times. That's one of the first places, not the power supply, but one of the first places you'll notice problems with electrolytic capacitors when they start to dry out and short internally is in the audio. Yeah, that's one of the, you know, if they don't go just completely fail, but as they start to go bad, a lot of times you'll start to lose like receiver performance. But one of the most noticeable things usually is audio. Your audio quality starts to go away. So anyhow, I thought I'd give this a quick once over. You know, give it a little bit closer inspection. You know, is the speaker itself bad, or is it just bad connections or bad contacts? Because like I say, the controls are so dirty they just weren't working. It had very little receive. The switch on the back was just crusty. You know, a shot of deoxit cleaned that up. And I'm looking over the board a little bit more, and I started to notice green in places where we should not have green. So what I'm seeing here is, if we can get down, get it to focus. So I've got this connector unplugged right here. If you look in the back side of the plug, what do you see? Green. So I pulled it out. What do I see down on the pins? They're green, and a bunch of oxidation or corrosion that flaked off when I unplugged it. So yeah, I'd definitely say this thing was stored in a damp environment. There's no ifs, ands, or buts now. Screws on the outside, yeah, it's hard to tell what it might have been through in its life. You know, screw heads on the outside being rusty is one thing, but when you start to see corrosion, and this connector is the same way, I see green on it and a couple other connectors in here, yeah, that's not a good sign. I'm really not sure what I want to do with this thing. Replacing all of these pins, yeah, it can be done. That's the thing, that it does work. Now, I did notice the range on the VFO stops at around like 700 something on every band. Doesn't matter what band you have it in, you'll tune from the bottom of that band, because this goes in 1 megahertz steps with the control. Or actually, it's got dual, you know, 1 megahertz steps here. Or actually, this is the bands, and then you get around, and it's actually 1 megahertz steps here. But you know, so it'll start out at 0, goes up to 1 megahertz, you know, from 1 megahertz to 2 megahertz, and so on. And you know, if you're in the 1 megahertz band, you'll get to 700 and something, and it just doesn't matter if the dial keeps going. You can watch your mechanical dial there. Yeah, it stops. It won't go in. It kind of struggling. Now that's, I don't want to say it's a known problem, but that is an issue that can be fixed with an alignment usually there. But yeah, this thing's been damp, not just, you know, like one time. So it has not been submerged in water. That's obvious. I know what water damage looks like. And if something had been spilled and somehow gotten in through the top, which is a solid sheet metal plate, it wouldn't have gotten to here. You know, there'd be water damage on the top of the board, but not down here. But yeah, so what do we do? Because the customer doesn't want to spend a boatload of money. So yeah, I'll have to go through and see. I'm going to have to unplug all these connectors and inspect all of them really good. But yeah, I mean, you can just see there's no silver down in there. It's just a solid block of green crap in that connector housing. And you know, that the problem with that is, if I let that go, it may work now. You know, I could unplug it, plug it in, you know, put a little bit of deoxit on there, plug it in and unplug it a few times. But you know, if that corrosion continues, eventually this wire is just going to boink. It's going to pop off, and you know, be game over then for whatever circuit, you know, depending on what connector it is. So yeah, I'll need to have a conversation with the customer and see if he wants to to do this. So, you know, I'm going to say caps. I need to check the speaker. The speaker may be bad. Like I say, it could just be a dirty... but the external speaker jack on the back works. That should... I have to check the schematic. I think that's just... between that and the phone jack, just a series connection. When you plug something in, it disconnects the speaker. So if I have sound there, I should have it at the speaker. So it may need a speaker. But yeah, these connectors, that's just going to be even more work. And man, I was so disappointed when I noticed that. What I was doing was unplugging and plugging all the connectors back in. I like to do that to reseat them, because even the tin terminals do oxidize over the decades. And just unplugging them and plugging them back in once or twice cleans the contacts up, be good for decades to come again. And that's when I started noticing green shit. So yeah, I guess I need to see if how far he wants to go with this, because now they're not all like that. So it's not like I need to repin every connector in this radio. You know, like fortunately it looks like blasted camera in the way here. I mean, like all of the big connectors here at the front, they're still all nice. You can see nice shiny metal from the backside where the wire comes out, but yet other ones are yeah, not so good. Yeah, there you can really see the green. I get the light just right there. Yeah. So, man, actually, you can see the corrosion. If I get the light just right, you can see that corrosion has creeped up the center conductor, because that's the little gray one here with a blue stripe. That's a coax cable. And if I get the light just right, you can see the corrosion has started to seep up into the center conductor of the wire there, because that's a transparent insulation on that wire. And yeah, it's starting to soak up into the wire itself. So, you know, I'd have to cut the wire off and get back up into good, fresh, clean copper. So, again, you don't know how far up in there. Yeah. Oh, that's so depressing. I hate corrosion. It can be such a pain in the butt trying to get rid of it. And if you don't, it just keeps going. And it's one of those things, once it starts, it doesn't stop. So, yeah, let me look over the rest of it. I need to now thoroughly check all the rest of the connectors. I need to pull the memory unit here, because as you can see, there's a boatload of wires that go into the memory unit. I need to check those connectors and see if it looks like it's only a few plugs or if it's a boatload of plugs. And yeah, then I'll contact the customer and see what he wants to do. We'll go from there. Okay, so we got the thumbs up to do the repairs. Customer wants the electrolytic capacitors replaced. I did go through and check all the other connectors. It's only a couple of them. So, I don't know. Now, the customer brought up a good point. He had said this, and I think I mentioned that earlier in the video. This radio belonged, the owner died. His wife has had this in a closet for like 5 years or something. And it's an older person. There's a good possibility, because I know he's seen it. I've seen people do it as well. You know, a couple that's been together a long time, husband or wife dies, they're by themselves, they don't need the whole house, and they'll like turn the air conditioning off, or the HVAC system to certain parts of the house. They don't use them anymore, and it saves energy. So they'll block off doors and whatnot. And this radio may have sat indoors, but it may have been possibly in an unconditioned room, and it got really humid. Not knowing he's in Tennessee, so yeah, it's the farther down south you get, the more humid it gets. So yeah, it's a possibility that could be all it is. So yeah, there's a couple connectors I'm going to have to chop the wires off, to shorten them up a little bit. Luckily, there's plenty of wire here for all these plugs. I can cut out a quarter or a half-inch of wire, put some new terminals on, extract the old pins, and put new ones in. The speaker is fried in this thing. Now, there's two ways of checking a speaker to see if it works. The first thing is disconnect one of the wires. Okay, so by removing one wire, you're removing the rest of the radio from the circuit. So there's no possibility that there's a short, or you eliminate everything else in the radio. You want to check just the speaker, so unhook one side. Now, you can check it with an ohm meter. So that's really simple to do. You just take your test meter, or your meter, hook your leads up. Polarity does not matter. The only thing the polarity markings on a speaker, basically what they mean to you is what direction the speaker cone moves when it receives an audio signal. But so yeah, for checking it, it's just a coil of wire. We should see usually speakers, an 8-ohm speaker, you'd see somewhere around 8 ohms or something, something like that. And I have, and you probably can't see it because I always have to do this to show it on camera. Utility, let's see, system, display, invert. So there, yeah, I've got the lead hooked up down here, and yeah, it just shows overload, so it's open. The other thing you can do, if you have something like a signal generator, just hook it up straight to the speaker. So just to demonstrate that, I just have this little, out of camera view here, this little speaker here just hooked up to the signal generator, and I'm just going to reach up here and turn the output on, and you can hear there's the sound coming out of the speaker. So doesn't need to be anything fancy, just a 1000 hertz tone into it. Now, of course, we know it's bad. We checked it with an ohm meter, but this is another thing you can do. So hook up the signal generator here, and as we would expect, because the speaker has an open voice coil, yeah, it's dead. But now sometimes you may have problems with audio. You're not sure if maybe the speaker's going bad. As speaker coils start to bind up, sometimes you'll get distorted sound. So it may measure fine with an ohm meter, but when you actually run an audio signal to the speaker, yeah, it sounds like crap. The signal generator is a great way, again, to test to see if it's the speaker or if it's something in the audio circuit. Disconnect the speaker, disconnect one side so it's isolated, hook up your signal generator to it, and if you have a signal generator that can sweep, that's even better, because then you can check its audio response over a frequency range. So, actually we can just hook this little critter here back up. Just stick him right down there, and I'll set the signal generator up for a sweep. Let's make the start frequency 300 hertz. And the stop, let's say, 5 kilohertz. So, that speaker sounds fine. So, if you've got a speaker that you're not sure if it's the speaker or if it's an audio circuit that's causing the problem, try it. And you don't need a sweep signal generator to test it at different frequencies. That just helps because it's automated. It sweeps through the entire audio range. But you can just hook up the signal generator and set your generator for like 500 hertz, then 1000 hertz, then 2000 hertz, then 3000 hertz, and see what it sounds like. But yeah, just because there's no sound coming out of a speaker doesn't mean that's the speaker. It could be a jack, like a phone jack or an external speaker jack. If the contacts, like this radio, if it's been stored in a damp spot, connections can get crunchy and they have mechanical contacts, because that's what happens when you plug in a jack. You see those little fingers in there, they make and break contacts. So if they've become oxidized, sometimes that can cause a problem with no sound. But yeah, it looks like in the case of this one, maybe that moisture problem got to the speaker voice coil and it's corroded, and it just, the wire's open now. So let me get to ripping this critter apart, because I actually have to remove all the boards, of course, to replace the caps in this thing. Get the Sony Bond glue off the top side of this radio, because yes, there is the ever-dreaded Sony Bond in one of these. So I want to get all that crunchy stuff out and clean it off all the leads for the ICs and any other components that it might be touching. But I've got the memory unit. I unhooked it so you can see the inside there for the memory unit. I'll have to pull it out because there's a couple electrolytic caps in here too. But yeah, our cap job on these isn't too awfully bad. I mean, there are a considerable amount in here, but honestly, it's not that bad because it's not a transceiver. There's not a gazillion of them in here. The biggest thing is getting the boards out. Luckily, everything's with plugs. So unplug if it's a cable where there's only one possibility. Like let's say this cable here. There's no chance it could stretch around and plug into another socket with the exact same amount of pins. You don't have to worry about it. Now, luckily, Yaesu did mark all these plugs. So, like this one's P13. This one here, you can see that on there. It says P12. This one's P1. So if you just randomly go through and pull all the plugs off, the plugs are marked. Pull the service manual out, you can see where they're supposed to hook up The other thing you can do is just grab something like a Sharpie and make little witness marks on the plug. So like this one here, if it didn't have markings on it, what you can do is just put a line like down one side. And then on the next plug, you know, like this one over here, you could put a line, get this wire out of the way, you could put a line on both sides. You know, like that. And then the next plug, you can put 3 lines on it. And then you can recycle your numbering system because different plugs have different amounts of pins. So if you've got only 5 plugs that have, let's say, 5 wires, well, you can go through your numbering system. And then if you get to plugs that only have, let's say, 4 wires, you can start over again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with marks again, because you don't have to worry the 4-pin plug's not going to properly fit into the 6-pin socket. I think you get my meaning there. But it's just a matter of popping the boards out of this thing, change the caps, and hopefully we should be back with a good sounding radio. So I shall return. Well, you can see we've got her torn apart. Actually, it's the radio itself's rather hollow right now, because actually every circuit board is out of it right now. So all of the boards are out, to include the memory unit and the power supply. So yeah, it's pretty much a hollow radio at the moment. But like I say, nice thing about these is it's modular. Everything's on plugs. Same thing with this. Everything's plugged in, so it's fairly easy to get out the boards. The only exception would be the power supply. This little power supply board, there are a couple wires on the power supply board. Now instead of trying to desolder them and then get that wire that's old crunchy solder on it back on the pins, I just trim them off really close to the board like you see there, just enough to where I can see the wire colors. And then when I go to reinstall this board, I can just strip the insulation off, have some nice fresh copper wire, wrap it around the pin, after I clean this gunk off, and just solder them back on. But a lot of times it's just easier to do that. Now I wanted to specifically show this board. This is the board if you take your top cover off. This is the board that will be and actually this is on the bottom. But yeah, I gotta think here. This is on the bottom of the radio, so if you take your bottom cover off, this is what you will see when you're looking on the bottom side of your radio. Very important board, synthesizer board. Now there's problems on this board that are just caused by old age. That's pretty much all there is. There's nothing you can do about it, and it depends a lot on just how the radio's been stored over the decades. Heating and cooling cycles, I believe, is what kills these things. And what kills them is bad solder joints. Now the majority of the board, anywhere outside of these 2 cans that have the shield covers over top of them, anywhere outside of these 2 cans, usually fine. Anything inside of these 2 cans, be very suspect. Oh my god, turn all these radios off. There's the CD, let me turn off the monitor. Got a half gazillion radios going here usually at any given time. So, if you're having problems, especially if you're having intermittent problems with one of these radios, pull this board out. It's not too hard. Couple screws around the outside edge, down the center here. You will have to take off the nut for the band selector, okay, because that comes out. You have to kind of pick up the back of the board to pull it up out. But it can be done, after you unplug all the plugs. But what you want to look for is these 2 areas here on the solder side of the board. So right here and right here. And you can see even where the can outline, where the tabs are, where it solders down. This board is no exception to any other one I've ever seen before. Boatload of bad solder joints. I quite honestly do not know how this radio worked. I was expecting a few cracked, possibly, not just completely broken out yet. There were several of them on this that were just completely shattered. I have no idea how they made contact. I have no idea how this thing was working. But I never had it on for a long length of time. So once this thing got hot, it may have had all kinds of intermittent problems. Now, main thing I wanted to show this for was my recommendation if you're going to fix bad solder joints. I've shown this in soldering videos before, but if you want to have good solder joints and you're fixing a bad solder joint, don't just grab your soldering iron, grab your solder, go, okay, there's a bad solder joint, and have at it. don't do that. Odds are you're going to create an inferior solder connection. What you should do is exactly what I've done to this board. Now, I'm ready to resolder this one. The problem with resoldering bad solder joints is they're cracked out. The solder's old for starters. Your radio's from the 70s or 80s, so you know it's several decades old. The surface of it gets oxidized. That's contamination. Well, if it's cracked out, again, everywhere where it's broken, and air and water can get into, you know, moisture in the air, and obviously we've had moisture problems inside this radio. That solder can oxidize. It's lead and tin. You know, back in the day, that would have been the standard composition, 60-40 solder, or even eutectic solder, 67 or 6337. But it oxidizes. So you're going to have all those contaminants in there. If you just grab your soldering iron, and I've seen people try to reflow solder connections with no fresh solder. That's even worse, because there's no flux to do any cleaning. So I highly recommend, if you're going to try and reflow a bunch of solder, or if you need to fix a bunch of bad solder joints, do what I did here. And it's fairly easy to see all of the ones that were bad. Let me grab a pointy stick here. You can look on the board and see I have desoldered them. And that is the best, honestly, the best thing you can do. So if you find one that are suspect, here or here, you know, I've completely desoldered all the pins for anything that I want to resolder. Same thing over here. I had a couple over here. You can see desoldered, desoldered, desoldered. Get the old solder out of there. That's the most important thing to getting a good solder connection when you redo this. Now, me personally, it's not necessary, because if you're using a good solder, you know, it's like Urson's multi-core here, really top quality solder. It has good flux in it to start with, but you're trying to fix a problem, and as I always say, flux, flux, flux. You can never have too much flux. So what I will do before I resolder any of these is I just grab my little bottle, if my circuit works, flux in there, and I'll apply some fresh new flux. Just I want to really flood the areas of these things with flux before I resolder them. Because you have to remember, your flux is a cleaning agent. So any oxidation that may still be on there, between the flux that I'm brushing on and the flux in your solder, when it heats up, it stands a lot better chance of cleaning that oxidation and gunk off of there and getting a good mechanical bond, or good molecular bond, because that's what soldering does. You're creating a new metal. You take copper and solder under heat, and you get a boundary layer in between those two metals. That's actually a new metal you're literally making on a microscopic, or atomic level, I guess you could say, but you're making a new metal. It's actually a composition of solder and whatever type of solder you're using, and the copper. But it's actually a new material you're making. And you want to have that really good bond. Contaminants get in there, it screws that up, and you'll just end up with bad solder joints again. So I just wanted to really quick show this. I'll get this resoldered. Everything's been recapped now, so there's fresh caps and everything. Should be good to go for another 30, 40 years or more before it has any more cap problems again. So actually there's all the old ones. And several of them were, when you pulled them out, you could see the leads on the bottom. They were starting to get rather corroded, so yeah, they were starting to leak a little bit, but no damage done. Especially like on this board, it's only single-sided board, so there's no circuit traces on the top side. The only thing in these radios that has double-sided board is this one, and that's your memory unit, so you can see all the circuit traces on here. So this is a double-sided board, but everything else is single-sided, so fairly easy to work on. Now, I wouldn't say you need to be gentle, because it's not like it's fragile, a thin, tiny piece of glass or something, but handle these boards with a little bit more care and caution than you would a modern, ultra high quality FR4 circuit board. These things, you can see they're kind of flexy. This is old brown boards. So the old brown boards are, they're a little bit, you can really get these things to flex, and you don't want to, when you're pulling one of these things out, like I say, this one is kind of squeezed down in there. Now, when I took this out, I didn't have a problem getting it out, because I had to take the faceplate loose to replace the speaker, which has already been replaced. But to get this speaker out, I have to take the faceplate, take all the knobs off, which, God, that was like a half-hour job getting all the knobs off, because all the shafts for the potentiometers were oxidized and the knobs were stuck on it. But I got the faceplate off, and then once I had the faceplate off, there's only 3 more screws that hold the entire front sheet metal structure on, so I was able to pull that off. So I could easily get this board out, but I've had to take these out when the faceplate's still on. It can be done, just be careful, because like I say, when you pull this board up, you're going to have a lot of wire over here, especially if you have the memory unit on your radio. There's going to be a big wire bundle right here, lots of plugs and whatnot. Just be careful when you're pulling this thing up and out that you're not flexing this board really bad right here, because the last thing you want to do is break off this ear where the band selector is. So just word to the wise and a word of caution. So let me get to, let me just get her flipped back over here. Let me get to soldering these connections back up, and I can clean the last of the dust bunnies and cobwebs out of the chassis that's sitting over there on the other table, and we'll get her back together, get an alignment done, and just see how well this works. Okay, so the frog, which these are affectionately known as, is pretty much done now. The only thing I have to do is cover and a couple screws and a few wire ties. You can see I have the battery pack over here. I had to clean some corrosion out of there, add a little bit of deoxit shield. I've got some of my rechargeables in there temporarily and put a new snap connector on there. But add the memory function, it stores memory, so, you know, unplug the power and kill the power. It holds memory just fine. Actually, I've got, I'll actually turn it on here, put it into memory. I've got the different bands. I just basically went from, you know, one band to the next and kept hitting the memory key on different, but you can see there, memory's working. So, what all did I do to it? Changed all the electrolytic capacitors, a few of those crunchy connections, several bad solder joints, and an alignment. Oh, one other thing I did do to this, and I forgot to mention it earlier, these things are known for having a running hot as a firecracker bridge rectifier on these things on the power supply board. I did add a heat sink to that. I'll show that in a second. It still runs hot, don't get me wrong, but adding the heat sink will help dissipate that heat more. That's just because those things, I mean, you could probably get a blister off of those things if you let the radio on long enough. They do run really warm. So, wanted to just really quick do some sensitivity tests, see if it's actually working as it should. Now, for starters, these things, as a lot of people that own these probably knows, you know, if you are a shortwave listener, this thing below 2 megahertz is, they're okay. Don't get me wrong, they're perfectly fine for listening on air, but they don't have superb or fantastic reception below 2 megahertz. Above 2 megahertz, yeah, they're great. From, you know, 2 megahertz up, you really don't have a problem with these things. So, you know, don't expect, if you get one of these things, to be able to, you know, as I say occasionally, you don't expect to be hearing a mouse fart at 100 yards with one of these things below 2 megahertz. Above 2 megahertz, yeah, fantastic receivers. So actually, for starters, let's actually look in the manual, and I'll see what the factory specs are. Didn't even think about that. What we got here? Here we go. Specifications. Now, they don't really state what the test conditions are for this, other than sensitivity. They don't tell you what they're measuring. Signal noise ratio, SYNAD, they don't really tell you. They just tell you at the different frequency bands what the sensitivity is. You know, AM and sideband, 30 microvolts on 500 ohms. Because remember, there are different antenna connections on the back of this. Sideband, 3 microvolts. 0.3 to 2 is 25, 500 ohm, and 2 microvolts. Sideband CW, and then from 2 megahertz up to 29,999, just say 30 megahertz. That's where reception's very good. So AM is that 5, I guess that's a 5, yeah. 5 microvolts. Now all of these measurements are 50 ohms, so, you know, connector. But 5 microvolts, sideband CW, 0.5 microvolts, and FM, 1 microvolt. So actually, let's just see. Now, we know, like I say, we know the lower end's going to suck. But usually the radios don't have a problem, at least meeting spec, and in a lot of cases actually far exceeding it. So I have the radio set to 500 kilohertz, and the communications test set over there is set to 500 kilohertz. It's putting a 2.3 microvolt signal into the radio. I have the external speaker has been replaced, and actually let me turn that's actually coming out of the communications test set. I'll unplug the cord here. So that's coming out of the speaker in the radio. Plug this back in, if I can find the jack with my finger. Okay. So, I need to turn it up a little bit. I've got a 2.3, and we're at, what, 10.7, 11. It's bouncing around a little bit. Make sure I got the tune up the whole way. So let's increase the signal level so we get to 12. So I'd call it around 3.17. And it calls for, what did we say here? 2 microvolts into 500 ohms. And that's the other thing. I've got this different antenna jack here, so it's actually going in the wrong port, not the long wire port. Let's just start off here with 2 megahertz. Actually 2.5. Well, I want to change the dial here. Oh yeah, we get blown out of the seat now. And I bumped the dial. And I'm in sideband, so that's gonna, if you change as you tune the radio, your frequency is going to change, because I do not have this is a carrier unmodulated. Right about there. And let's just go down to 1 microvolt. Let's just start at a 0.1. No, hell, it's even receiving at 0.1. So, yeah, turn this down some. So it's at about 0.07 microvolts for 12 dB SYNAD, and they're calling for 0.5 microvolts. So yes, excellent receive sensitivity, and we can try some other bands. So let's go up to 10.5. Now it's not going to be the same. It does change, and actually it starts to drop off the higher up you get in band, but it still easily meets spec. So your best sensitivity is going to be right around 2 megahertz, and then it slowly drops. As you go up in frequency, the sensitivity slowly drops off a little bit. But as you can see, 0.11. Let's go up to 15.5. So about 0.14. 20.5. Say 0.19. 25.5 megahertz. .31. And 29.5. This is the one it might struggle to reach spec, but they usually do. I haven't actually tested this one yet, so I don't know. Oh, it's close. Ah, look at that. It just bounces it into 12. So yeah, it's right there. 0.5 microvolts. Up toward the top of the band. So it still meets spec. So let's try FM. So let's see here. And we'll do, let's say 3 kilohertz deviation. and spec was 1 microvolt. It easily meets it, bouncing around there a little bit. Let's just drop down to, let's say, 20.5. Oh yeah, you can tell we get down in frequency, and FM sensitivity definitely picks up. So right around 0.22. Drop down to 10.5 megahertz. Just say 0.13. And we'll do 2.5 megahertz. Stay right 0.09. So that's fantastic. I mean, they're calling for, what the heck did I say? 1 microvolt, and it's 0.09. And let's try AM. So we'll do 30% modulation. AM. Now, you'll see, actually let me get the level turned up here some. Okay, so there's narrow, because you have to remember this radio has 3 positions. So it has narrow, medium, and wide. And just see what effect that has on the sensitivity. Because you have to remember, as you narrow the band, you're getting less noise, but you're also getting less bandwidth. But you'll notice if I go out to wide, you can hear that. Yeah, it's mainly just noise. Sensitivity drops down to next to nothing. Now you have to remember, we're also putting in just a steady 1 kilohertz tone. This isn't modulated audio with a voice, with a varying audio frequency. But you can see as we narrow it up, so if I go to medium, it's picked up, and then to narrow, it picks up really well. So, you know, that just demonstrates what effect switching between narrow, medium, and wide has. So, you know, medium is normally where I listen to these radios, narrow in extremely noisy conditions. And if you're somewhere where it's extremely clear, there's just no noise whatsoever, and you know, it's like the person you're listening to is right next door to you, yeah, wide is perfectly fine then. So, actually, here's the inside. Oh, and one other thing, these radios, common problem and complaint, the camera twisted around here. Okay, one common complaint with these things, and this radio is no exception. When you would turn the dial, you'd get about, right about here. That was all the far. It didn't matter if you kept turning the dial, you could not get up on any band, up around, and it depends because the VCO operates in different chunks of the band, but you couldn't get up above, like, whatever the megahertz was, whatever band you were in, around 800 to 820, that was it. You'd keep turning the dial and it doesn't go up. If you have that problem, it's fairly simple to fix. Matter of fact, the alignment instructions for how to do that is actually in the instruction manual. Not just the service manual, it's even in the owner's manual. But all that's happened is your VCO voltage has drifted high over the years, and what's happening is you're getting, once you get to this point, you know, in this radio, when I'd get to right around here, I was at 8 point something volts. There was just, and then as you turned up, there's no more voltage swing. So there's no more change in VCO voltage, and it can't tune any higher. So what you have to do is you go in, there's a test point in there. It's, like I say, it's clearly spelled out in the instruction manual how to adjust that. But what you need to do is bring it down to, I think it's like, 7.4 volts, I think. Actually, just let's look at that really quick. PLL units. Yeah, 7.4 volts. So you can see 5 megahertz, actually it's all of them, the 5, 12, 20, and 29 megahertz. You're adjusting for 7.4 volts. But what will happen is the voltage drifts high over the years. So, you know, at lower frequencies, the voltage is stuck, and it can't, there's, like I say, there's no more range. You keep turning, but the VCO voltage has reached its maximum, so it can't change frequency anymore. So it's just a matter of turning that down. And that's on the bottom side. I'll show you where that's actually at. But there's the top side. So, yeah, just a general clean out. All the caps changed on all the boards. Actually, you know, I think you saw all the boards when I had them out of the radio. But all those have been changed. Turn her off, get her disconnected here. Get everything unplugged, make it easier to flip over. Snap the battery connector here. That's one of the last things I actually have to do. I have to reroute this back down through the front here and get it wire tied back in before I seal this critter up. So and there's the underside, and this normally just comes up through here, gets wire tied back along here, and then this is just floating around in here and then snaps onto the battery connector. But your adjustments for the VCO voltage, they're right here. So, you know, there's 4 adjustments there. Like I say, it clearly spells out in the manual what to adjust, but that's the problem. The problem's in here. It's just a matter of bringing your VCO voltage down at the top end of its range. So, you know, you'd set the scale, your analog dial on the scale for your VFO to 1000, and then on each of the specified bands, you're going to adjust those transformers, actually, those transformers right there. You're going to adjust each of those for 7.4 volts. And that'll fix your loss of tuning at the top end of of the bands. Oh yeah, heatsink. So easiest thing to do is just find what I got a bunch of these. These are 220 size transistor package heat sinks. So on the other side, normally where that little screw hole is, actually, that's where you would mount a transistor. But they also happen to be the exact same width as that bridge rectifier right there. So I just take a little bit of thermal adhesive or glue, put a dot of glue on the top of that, stick that heat sink on there, and that'll help to dissipate some of that heat. Because like I said, that thing really gets hot, you know, and it's touchable now. And I just turned it off, so. And that's about it. There's really not a lot else on these. Like I say, fix some of the wiring connections. Bad solder joints are common in both, you know, on the underside of the board, but the areas for both of these cans, I think the reason you have bad solder joints in these 2 areas, and you usually don't have them anywhere else, you may get the occasional one, but it's the wax. Now, you should not remove the wax. The wax is in there for a reason. It's in there to help stabilize temperature. You know, it kind of acts as an insulation. The problem is the wax, as the radio changes temperature, because it heats up and cools down when you turn it on and off, the components are trying to move while they're stuck inside of that block of wax, and that's what happens. They end up pulling out the solder joints. So like I say, if you ever have intermittent connections, that's the first thing to do is pop this board out. A lot of times you'll find them there. You know, like if you lose a band or several bands, it's a possibility you've lost your VCO voltage at one of these adjustments, you know, in one of the VCO circuits here. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind if you're having intermittent problems, especially if you take, you know, the bottom cover of your radio off, and if you go like this, you know, just kind of push on the board around here, you know, somewhere in here, and it comes back to life and goes away and comes back to life. Yeah, you've probably got bad solder joints. And I guess that's about it. Because they really didn't have a smoking lot to, you know, or a heck of a lot of stuff to do to this thing. Just a basic recap. Oh, and the speaker, of course. There's the original speaker, and yep, that is a door nail. So it has a brand new speaker in it now. And actually, I had cleaned up the front cover because I had to take it off, of course, to do the speaker and everything else. And the front cover actually cleaned up pretty nice now. So, oh, come on, camera. This octopus mount here. So the knobs look, well, actually the knobs, the faceplate, everything, it had a, I guess you'd say a coating of mildew, or some type of fungus, but a lot of dirt. I mean, you had seen the knobs before. They were just nasty. You couldn't even see the white line for the white gunk that was on there. Like I said, I think it's mainly all mildew. And this thing definitely was stored somewhere where it was humid or damp. Yeah, so it actually cleaned up really nice. It's got a few little battle scars across the top there, but nothing you wouldn't expect for a radio, this age, especially one that's been bounced around and not taken care of for a while. So it's actually survived rather well. But there you go. There's the Frog, or Yaesu FRG-7700, back up and ready to run and do some listening for the customer.